Hello, and welcome to the Americanized Podcast with me, Ibrahim.
I'm Hamza.
Skyler.
David.
And today we'll be talking about the book Americanized, Rebel Without a Green Card. So the first 50 pages describe Sarah's situation. We learn about how she must deal with the fear of being deported at all times. We are also told about the situation in Iran and how America and the British affected Iran, and how there was a new set of strict rules after the Islamic Revolution. Sarah and her sister Samaria grew a tight relationship after they go to the same school and begin to trust each other more. So we'll be talking about how immigrants assimilate to American culture and how we can learn more from this book.
Yeah, the essential question is, how can immigrants assimilate to American culture without losing their culture from their own country? One idea I had about the legitimate power held by Ayatollah Khomeini caused Sarah and her family to be pushed away from their home country in Iran and moving towards America. They then had to adjust to America while still maintaining their Iranian culture, which created like a conflict of cultures for them. One piece of evidence from the book is how there were suddenly strict dress codes and Western music and movies were banned and alcohol became illegal, which kind of shows how many changes were being made, and they felt like they were forced to a strict rule set that they didn't agree with. And in an article I read that adds to my point, it said one's willingness to accept an outcome or even to correct it depends on whether the underlying procedure is deemed legitimate, which kind of shows their motives of why they wanted to move out of the country in favor for America.
That's a fair point and all, considering all the conflicts they went through trying to adjust and maintain both an American and Iranian culture. I agree that they were definitely affected by legitimate power. After all, if you look at the textual evidence, in quote, America and Israel helped establish Savak. They played a significant role in the torture and murder of thousands of Shah detractors on page 12. And outside evidence, creating dress codes and making many things illegal in Iran is similar to the U.S. trying to ban TikTok. It's their way of censorship and dictating what their public can and cannot see.
Yeah, you definitely bring up some good evidence that show how outside factors definitely played a huge part in Sarah and her family's decision to move to America and away from all the conflicts in Iran. Abuse of power is seen by many of the leaders throughout the world. One point in the book that showed this was when the Ayatollah increased the price of oil, which created more dislike for the Pahlavi dynasty and gave birth to the Iranian Revolution, which shows how when they get tired of the abuse of power, they stand up against it, kind of how Sarah did by moving out. And another point I saw in an article was how Iranian and American relations have been notoriously poor since the 1979 revolution.
One point I found is that the informational power regarding Sarah and Samaria showed how immigrants have to be much more careful about being law-abiding, legal or not. This shows how dangerous the power of information is and what it can do to those who don't have it. This made it harder for them to fully assimilate, as they never fully felt Americans due to the lack of citizenship. A textual evidence support would be, the government doesn't know we exist, we can be deported at any time. A outside evidence shows this is how there are both positives and negatives of immigration. Immigration fuels the economy. When immigrants enter the labor force, they increase the productivity capacity of the economy and raise the GDP.
I agree that informational power was a very important key concept in the story, since Sarah and Samir weren't even able to trust their friends with their false address and immigration status. A quote in the book proves this by declaring that while our friends were in on our address fraud, my sister and I preferred not to advertise our undocumented immigrant status to them. I was too afraid of how girls who'd been born in America would judge me if I confessed that I wasn't supposed to be living in the country. After that, I found an article that stated that illegal immigration provides the means and opportunity for terrorism to exist. It presents opportunities for crime.
I agree. However, later on in the story, Sarah obtains her work permit, essentially giving her an excuse to need a social security number. While Sarah sees this as a big relief, it's also a burden because it shows how the government knows of her existence now. Obtaining the work permit is a step forward of assimilation as she is implementing American factors into her life. Some textual evidence. It had been 12 years since we have moved to the States, and now the government finally knew I existed. This was both a relief and totally terrifying. If they knew I existed, wouldn't it be easier for them to track me down and deport my ass? Outside evidence, the mass majority of ICERO's interior removals shows 92% had criminal convictions or pending criminal charges.
One of my thoughts about the essential question is that this book has shown how spending time with people from other cultures can change a person's lifestyle. The author, Sarah, unconsciously mimicked her husband's behaviors in the book. The example shown here is showed since Sarah changed her eating habits by using a fork instead of a spoon, which surprised her father. And the textual evidence is that you eat rice with a fork now? My Baba asked a few years ago as he watched me eat my dinner. It was an innocent question, but I could sense the disappointment in his tone. In an article I found online, it stated, in reality, immigrants change culture for the better by introducing new ideas, expertise, customs, cuisines, and art.
It's interesting how they need to balance their own culture with the American culture. Without understanding the customs and culture of American culture, it would be hard to be as successful, I would say, in this society. Like, for example, the culture of being friendly. In Sweden, it's not the norm to greet people if you don't know like who they are or if you're familiar with them. But in the U.S., it could come across as being rude. Like, if you're at a cashier or something and you don't say, "Hi, how was your day?" Like, believe it or not, plucking your eyebrows in Iranian culture is not allowed, maybe. It's more of a rite of passage for Iranian girls, where they don't pluck their brows until they turn 15. I think, Hamza, you were showing me an article where it was saying how parents' relationships quality affected the children directly or indirectly via the parent-child relationship, which is interesting because the culture is passed from parent to child. So depending on how their relationship, how strong it is, could influence how the ethnic culture translates into the person's personal culture along with the culture from the society they immigrate to.
I see your point, Ibrahim, but I think that there are also negative aspects of some cultures. Some parents may be more strict compared to others due to being raised differently, or also if they want their kids to be more successful. And it sounds like but she also limited Sarah by the Persian customs, as it states in the book. Persian parents allow their kids to choose from only 4 occupations. And in the outside evidence support, I found an article that states it gave a reason as to why immigrant parents would prefer their kids to have a certain career. Many of us have heard stories of struggles within our families and the adversity parents or grandparents face trying to make it in this country.
The relationship of Sarah and her sister Samira implements referent power as they were able to grow closer and adjust together through personal qualities. The sibling bond allowed for the immigrants to assimilate more easily due to the fact that they had each other to rely on while facing all the struggles of the clashing cultures. For example, something similar is my mom and her sisters. They didn't have friends for a long time or a long period of time that they could rely on. Rather, they became best friends with each other. They had to rely on each other because these were the staples that they had throughout their entire life, that they could rely on consistently. So it's similar to how Sarah and her sister Samira interact. So Sarah was saying how her sister warned her to stay with her like a refrain through the rest of her teenage years. Otherwise, they could get deported at any time. So they had to rely on each other throughout the book because those were the only people who could understand their struggles.
I agree with what you were saying, and that was an interesting piece of outside evidence that you provided that shows how important the sibling bond is between immigrants. In the book, Sarah and Samira were able to build off each other to better themselves, which helped them grow and become more comfortable with the new country that they moved to. Their strong bond, when compared to their previous relationship, which was filled with arguing earlier on in the book, is a much more positive one for both sides. One piece in the text that showed this was how early on she said that I hated my older sister, Samira, and when you compare that to how she viewed her towards the end of the book, it like shows a lot of growth. And a piece of evidence I read in an article was that relationships among siblings play a crucial role in early socialization and further social development. And it would be obvious how important it would be to have these siblings bond, especially for immigrants when they have to adapt.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. No bonds between the two would mean that they had nobody to rely on when times get tough. Their relationship has grown so much from earlier in the story to later in the book. They went from not wanting to do anything with each other to now feeling a very strong connection with each other. These bonds are reflective of all immigrants who had siblings to ease their process of adapting to a whole new country with a very different culture from their own. It's like Sarah says, because that's what happens when you connect with someone. They laugh, you laugh. You cry, they cry. It's when you have that bond with someone, you feel what they feel. Like Gao says, siblings form bonds since they support each other and have shared many experiences together, like Sarah and Samira, and like all immigrants in general.
I believe that people must become more accepting and welcoming to immigrants. They have to go through so much to assimilate to the new country, which can be very stressful for them. Aside from the stress of new culture, they also have to face all the legal troubles that come along with immigrating to a different country too.
We should consider the points raised because they're important in considering the impacts that immigration can have on immigrants
I agree.
and their family. These are millions of people who have gone through the struggles that are described in the book every day. They are forced to live with a constant fear of deport.
Definitely agree with that. And I think that the larger implications of this are changing the immigration legal system. The way that immigrants are treated is something that should be looked at to make it less stressful for them. This way, much of the stress that comes with immigration can be lifted and overall can become an easier process for them.
I agree. But what still needs to happen is that we must work as a society to make it easier and safer, creating a system that is more accepting and less harsh on immigrants.
This has inspired the conversation from being less restrictive on immigrants. Creating a system where immigrants, especially those fleeing from another country, can easily become legal U.S. citizens, so that situations like the one that Sarah and her family went through can be avoided.
Thanks for listening to our podcast on the book Americanized. Tune in next time on this podcast as we discuss more about the book. You can stay up to date by following us on Instagram.
Until next time.